My next step for the reader is really to remind of C.S. Lewis's thing. If your theology is mainly built around a study of demons, I like to say I think we have a discipleship problem. All of these stories point to Jesus, and I think we need to balance our demonology with healthy pneumatology, studying the Holy Spirit, thinking about having a deep relationship with Jesus Christ, and just really being rooted in, Christology, to say, or even having in-depth doctrine of God. There can be a temptation. This is fascinating stuff. And there can be a temptation to sort of let it overtake you.
Something happened
in the midst of this culture.
What you're describing, your experience is all of a sudden now.
And it's an intentional journey.
And that end is relationship with God.
Welcome to Faith in the Fold, a podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Bird. Today on the show, I'm delighted to have Dr. Joy Vaughan, Assistant Professor of New Testament at Asbury University in Wilmore, Kentucky. With her PhD in biblical studies from Asbury Theological Seminary, Dr. Vaughan's areas of expertise include Lucan scholarship, as well as possession and exorcism accounts in the Synoptic Gospels and Acts, among many other topics as well. Joy, it is a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's great to be here with you today.
Yeah, good to have you. And you were saying earlier before we started that this is your first podcast, right?
Yes, this is my foray. Faith into the Fold. You get the first one.
All right. So first of many, because this book that we're going to talk about here in a little bit sounds really exciting. And you told me that you've already got an interview coming up later, right?
I do. I have one next week.
All right. I will. Man, I need to try to get this episode out before they do, just so we can. No, okay. Well, hey, you're at Asbury University. How long have you been teaching there? What kinds of things do you teach? And what was it like being at Asbury University? Back in February when Asbury was in the news for something pretty special. Tell us all about it.
So I started teaching at Asbury University in 2013 as an adjunct professor, and during my coursework and my dissertation writing at Asbury Theological Seminary. And it was a great joy to be able to teach while also studying. It gave me a great opportunity to share with what I was doing. So when I graduated with my PhD in biblical studies in 2020, I then started in the fall of 2020 teaching at Asbury University. And it's a great joy to have been here at Asbury University. This would be the beginning of my 4th year of teaching.
Right.
And so at Asbury University, I have a great opportunity to teach all of our students courses in Old Testament studies. I teach a lot of OT 101, a survey course, New Testament studies like NT 100, survey to the New Testament. And then we have a course on the foundations of Christian thought, the Christian theology. And so I teach all of those to our general population of students. And then I also have courses for Bible and theology majors and minors. A really fun course that I like to teach is one on New Testament and the end times, and just bringing a really biblical backbone.
That's really
to
exciting. Yeah.
What it's what it's like to interpret Revelation, and to really help students see that course, that book, I would say, in a more hopeful perspective about what is really going on there. A lot of students come with a lot of fear to that text, and to help them reframe it. This is the book of hope. And so I love what I get to do here at Asbury. This past spring, we had what we call an outpouring event at Asbury University, where we had probably over 50,000 visitors to Wilmore, Kentucky. And I can remember going to lunch after chapel and then coming back. And I just was like, wow, there's still music going on. There's something going, there's something stirring. And I just felt this drawing, I'm entering Hughes, and I want to go up. My office goes down the stairs, and I wanted to go up. And I walked in the back, and I saw students just pouring their hearts out to God in worship. And I saw joy-filled smiles, and I saw lament, and I saw repentance. and I saw students who were really hungry to be met by God. And I stumbled my way down to the second row on the left of the auditorium and joined them in worship. And what I felt was just a beautiful manifestation of God's presence among our students. A little later on in the afternoon, our president had said, "Hey, something's going on. If you want to go to Hughes, go to Hughes and witness what's going on." We had no idea at that moment that what had started with just a few would grow into thousands and thousands and
Yeah.
thousands. And I've never seen anything like it in Wilmore, Kentucky.
Mhm.
The last weekend that it was here, I had to show an ID to get into town to prove that I lived there to be able to access the town, because we had so many people
Yeah.
who wanted to come experience what was happening in Hughes, and just taking a pilgrimage to
Mhm.
experience God. And that just was really a great thing to be a part of. And spent time praying with students, and then visitors and guests at the altar, and worshiping together, praying together, really being transformed by God in those moments. What's cool now is to hear the stories. So we're beginning to hear more and more stories from students, from new students who came to experience Outpouring, but now they're here as students.
Mhm.
And even to continue to see the testimony of the work of God unfold in the lives of those who had that experience, and just carrying it forward, and also to see how it's had an impact on a variety of other places. So to come and experience, and we've had sendings where people will then go and really, be at this isn't meant to stay here at Hughes. It was always meant to be God's story. If you think of Abraham, for instance, would be a light into the nations,
Mhm.
and that God's presence would be everywhere. Ezekiel's vision of the temple, that the temple would be like expand,
Mhm.
so that the God's presence fills the whole city. And the promise of Revelation that one day all creation will be redeemed, God's
Mhm.
presence will be everywhere, and everyone will be worshiping him. So when I think of it kind of through that great lens. Yeah.
Yeah. It was it was neat, from an outsider's perspective. Outsider because I wasn't there in person, but I was, still have friends. Yourself, Tom Lyons, whom I interviewed right around the time. I think it was maybe March or April. I did kind of a two-part interview with Tom, and did some other stuff where I talked a little bit about what I saw was going on. My friend Lee, who's still writing his dissertation there on campus, still preaching in Nicholasville. It was really fascinating to see how people from a variety of denominational backgrounds, and maybe that also includes a variety of understandings about how the Spirit works, how the Spirit moves. They frequently described it in the way that you described it, that there was a sense, it was almost palpable, that there really is something very warm and inviting and alive there. And it is that kind of an accurate quick summary of
Yeah,
sort of what you experienced?
absolutely. I mean, and to me, this term kind of gets tossed around. It was maybe the first word I used when somebody said, "What's going on?" And I said, "I don't know precise. I don't really know, but I can remember saying it's just really sweet. There's just
Mhm.
this very sweet presence of God, of peace that is palpable when you walk into Hughes." And um, yeah, it just, I couldn't have told you what would have happened at that moment, but I just thought, wow. And to be here and to know our student population and to see them experiencing God, just really was so exciting to be an eyewitness to
Mhm.
see this generation of students experiencing God for themselves, and having those moments together.
Yeah. Now, at the risk of forcing a somewhat awkward segue, your book is about something similar, right? About outpourings, or movements of spirits, or things like that, right?
Yes.
That's and so I we were talking before the interview started, and I mentioned that, like, I have been asking to interview you about this topic for months and months now, and praise God, your book is out.
My
and
book is
I'm
out. I'm holding
super
it in my
excited
hands
about
for
it.
those of you who have a video.
There it is.
And
Tell
so
us the title and tell us what it's about.
this book is entitled Phenomenal Phenomena, and the subtitle is Biblical and Multicultural Accounts of Spirits and Exorcism. And this book is about, well, to make that segue a little more comfortable, I remember having a moment in my study carrel at Asbury Theological Seminary where I began to think about how we're so comfortable with the idea of the Holy Spirit being real. Whereas, we have some comfort with that idea throughout Orthodoxy, throughout church history. There's a good bit of conversation about pneumatology. Now, far less is there conversation about what it looks like to think about evil spirits. And I began to think about, okay, good spirit, evil spirit, how is it plausible to sort of believe in the one and totally axe out the others?
Right,
And
yeah.
is this some biased thinking that we have here? Our New Testament writers don't seem to write like that. Westerners sometimes tend to think like that. And so I thought, I wonder what it means to be consistent, to interpret through this spiritual worldview that is found in antiquity. Something that is really assumed, not justified or explained. In other words, there's no argument for the existence of spirits that you find in the New Testament accounts. They just kind of show up.
Right.
So what do you do with that? And so my book is really about how to read these spirit possession and exorcism stories in the Gospels and Acts. So when you approach the story, like the Gerasene or the Gadarene, depending on your textual
Yeah.
viewpoint there,
Right, yeah.
what the actual name is,
Mhm.
when you approach a story like that, how do you read it? What do you do with it? And there are three main ways in scholarship that these stories are approached. The first one comes to us from scholars like Rudolf Bultmann or Martin Debelius, where there's a demythologization that goes on in the text. And so these accounts, such as that one, are legendary tales. They're trying to prove something. Particularly the early church thinks that these were meant to prove that Jesus was the Messiah and that Jesus didn't really exercise in these ways. And so in this way, and this kind of lens, these are not historically plausible events and probably not eyewitness accounts. And that comes really, I think, from the influence of the Enlightenment. So that's the
Yeah.
first way. But I think
Then,
the
and
question,
just to hop in real quick, those guys you mentioned, Rudolf Bultmann, Martin Debelius, those guys were flourishing, 100-ish, we'll round it up, 100-ish years ago, and
yeah,
they predominated German scholarship, which 100 plus 100 or so years ago, the center of New Testament studies was really the European continent. You might
yeah,
think
and it's not
today it's probably more America or maybe Britain, but 100 years ago in a different generation of scholarship, it was the European continent. So those guys were kind of at the top of the game there.
Yeah, and being products of their own environment, we're thinking of Enlightenment thinking and principles of modernity. And you have, this idea of like, how can you unveil yourselves to like electricity and new technology and then yet still believe that spirits are real? And so they're really grappling with this through their own lenses. And it's helpful to remember that, it's not to bash them or something like that, but
Yeah.
they're really products of their times. The second way that New Testament scholars tend to like to interpret or read these accounts is through socio-political lenses. And so
Okay.
you think about oppressive political leaders who produce difficult situations, maybe being subjugated, and that can often lead to something like a mental health problem or physical health problems. And so they look at the list and say, well, it's because these folks were living in oppressive environments or difficult situations that they're actually having these problems. So the problem isn't spiritual, it becomes a social or political problem. And so
Yeah.
those are two ways texts are sometimes read or interpreted, really. And a third way is a battle with Satan. In other words, that in antiquity, there is a belief in malevolent spiritual beings, and these beings can cause a lot of problems in a person's life, whether it be a physical problem, a mental problem, or other sorts of problems. And so how do we read these texts? How do we interpret them? Can be difficult. And so that's what my book is attempting. That's really the problem I'm trying to unravel is, are these eyewitness testimonies where they're plausibly historical, not arguing for straight up historicity. That's really hard to prove. But are these really plausible stories that Jesus
Yeah.
could have exorcised a spirit and someone gets well?
Mhm.
The bent over woman then stands up and she had a spiritual problem. Or is this really something that could have happened in Jesus's time?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I have that I found to be particularly interesting in our in our research, and so like your focus has been that. My focus was on, all right, how do we actually do the work of history so we can ask questions like, what would be the most plausible reconstruction? And what's interesting is Jesus's supporters, his followers, as well as Jesus's detractors, agreed that he was known for performing these kinds of miracles, that he was known for casting out demons. And when you have a tradition like that, okay, that's still one step removed from proving that the thing actually happened. With that word proof there, that's a tough word. That's tough.
Word.
But in terms of how a historian would look at this, a historian can say, as I know you land on, and as I know I've landed on, a historian can say, man, the best evidence that we have is that Jesus had this reputation. Okay, so then what generated, that reputation? That's ultimately where some of our research has gone to. Help us provide a little bit of context. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me just respond to that with a little piece that if you look in historical Jesus studies, there's really not much debate on whether or not Jesus was an exorcist. So from the New Testament side, like everybody sees Jesus as an exorcist.
Yep.
Now, how you interpret these events or if
Right.
they're historically plausible are two different stories. So sometimes it's kind of helpful to get that on a spectrum. But I thought maybe I would read just a little bit of what I illustrate as some of the problem.
Please give us a little
very
teaser of your book, so we'll keep hyping it up.
And so this kind of illustrates maybe the problem for a Western reader. Okay. And so there's this little anecdote that I used to start the book, and it was crafted by John S. Mabiti, and he illustrates the reductionistic nature of Westernized viewpoints. He says the parable tells of a talented and gifted African student who travels westward to receive a theological education for ministry in his home setting. So he gets a Western degree, and Mabiti narrates the little parable or the anecdote. Finally, he got what he wanted, a doctorate in theology. He was anxious to return home. At home, relatives, neighbors, old friends, dancers, musicians, drums, dogs, cats, and all gather to welcome him back. Suddenly, there is a shriek. Someone has fallen to the ground, and the chief says to him, "You've been studying theology overseas for 10 years. Now help your sister. She's troubled by the spirit of her great aunt." He looks around. Slowly, he goes to get Bultmann, looks at the index, finds what he wants, reads again about spirit possession in the New Testament. Of course, he gets the answer. Bultmann demythologized it. And so I think in our Western theological approach to this, we really haven't nuanced a multicultural perspective. And so if I could move forward a little bit, what do I mean by that? In 74% of societies, there's experience of the phenomena of spirit possession. And it's actually growing in the West. I read something it might have been in the New York Times, where it's like 50% of Westerners now believe that spirits are real. And so
I would believe that. Yeah.
I would say it's probably maybe accurate. I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to go back and look at all the statistics and such. But even in our theological environments, sometimes these texts can make us uncomfortable, and we have a real problem. So what I thought is, you put on this multicultural lens. What if we could learn from an interreligious study of spirits and exorcism and possession from a wide variety of global perspectives and a wide variety of religious perspectives, and then ask, how do these events, do they compare at all? What does looking at this from a global perspective bring to the Westerner? And so that's a big part of the book, is looking at a lot of stories from anthropology and ethnography and seeing how does this play out in the major regions of the world.
Yeah. You've mentioned the term Western a couple of times. One thing that I have tried to show my Bible classes, particularly and in like the last few months, because I've been going over, I taught Ephesians on a Sunday morning a few months ago. And then most recently, I've just finished up Colossians, and I'm also preparing for a series of lectures at the end of September at my alma mater on Colossians. And one thing I've really tried to show is, for people who come from a culture that is much more spiritually sensitive, that's the way I've been using it, a much more spiritually sensitive culture, knowing that Jesus is the cosmically powerful, all-sufficient, enthroned Christ, who is the creator of not only the creator, but is also a ruler of all of these entities that may be troubling them. That's incredibly good news. But that kind of thinking has tended to maybe be somewhat absent in the last maybe 100, 200 years within Western cultures. But like you said, that is starting to change. I'm curious, Joy, how do your students respond to stories like this when you get to stuff like this in the Old Testament or in the New Testament? Do they say, yeah, man, that's weird? Or do they say, oh yeah, like that kind of stuff actually makes sense based on my own experience or whatever they know? Like, how do they respond?
Yeah, I think they respond with a lot of interest, and there's a lot of interest in spirituality in our general sort of American environment. I think that would, you could say that in even the larger Western environment, but I know at least in our American environment, there's a lot of interest in spiritual things right now. And so I did have an opportunity last fall to teach a course, and the title of the course was Demons and Spirits. And so we got to go through all of these texts together.
I'm so jealous. Wow, that's wild.
And it is a little wild. I'm not sure I like being the demons professor. Some things I didn't really think about before I chose this topic. It has that effect.
Hey, go see Dr. Vaughan if you want to know about all the scary stuff.
Yeah. And a little shout out to Dr. Steve Siemens. I went across the street because he was known for teaching a sort of a spiritual warfare course at the seminary.
Okay.
And I went over, I said, I have an opportunity to share with students biblical perspectives, theological perspectives. And then I brought in several people to tell their stories. So I had several from different parts of the world who had experience being demonized, and then had exorcism stories to tell, either exorcism official or deliverance stories. And
can you briefly explain what demonized means? Sorry to interrupt, but I suspect that might be a term that some listeners might not be familiar with.
Oh yeah, of course. So the term possession actually comes more from anthropology than it does from necessarily New Testament studies. So a demonization, intriguingly, in the New Testament, there's no real term that says this person was like possessed or oppressed.
Yeah.
In other words, they were demonized is the language.
That's actually the Greek verb, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually the Greek verb. So they have a demon. Now, is the demon external or internal? The text isn't actually saying. The text will tell the characteristics of the problems that the demon has. So the term possession is helpful because you can really lean on how anthropologists have used it and how it's been defined, and so on. And there's a lot to that, which I'll spare you all of that sort of
go read the book.
Detail. Yeah, go read the book, because that gets a little bit nuanced.
But you got to teach that class, and Dr. Siemens was able to bring in people who can tell their stories.
I thought to myself, this could get really dark really fast. The first time I've taught this course, and how do we keep this from getting too dark or having too much focus on evil? because there is a risk there to overemphasize, just have this depth of theology of evil. We need to match it with the theology of good, right?
Yeah.
And thinking about what are the good things. Sometimes we have, and even you can have students who tend to want to focus on everything that's bad, not recognizing the good. And so shout out to Dr. Steve Stevens, who said, this is an opportunity, to make their Jesus bigger. Jesus is more powerful than any spirit in his encounters, and make their Jesus bigger. And so we had a great time, a grand time going through that course. It's actually, students keep requesting that course to come back around again. I didn't get to take it. I want to do it. And it gave us an opportunity to think about, passages like Ephesians 6 and what does the armor of God have to do with spiritual warfare, or even the question, what actually is spiritual warfare?
Yeah.
We got to do some stuff too.
Yeah. We've been touching on this throughout the conversation so far, but help us provide a little context here, Joy. How would you describe the Bible's spiritual worldview? It's not just God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit and some angels, right? I mean, there seems to be a little bit more going on, but that surprises some people when you actually begin to press them and say, all right, well, let's read the text and see what it says. Some people are surprised. Help us kind of work through some of that.
Well, there are all sorts of spiritual beings that show up through the Bible. You think about, the cherubim who guard the Ark of the Covenant. You think about the angels who are messengers that help portray God's message to his people. I think about even how Hebrews starts, where this is mediated by an angel, a messenger.
Yeah.
You have these angels among you. I think it's really important though, well, let me keep going. If you think of Genesis 6, the sons of God and the daughters of men, and what in the world happened there? Is that something spiritual, or is it simply intermarriage, or something more? I think here in scholarship, Michael Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, has helped to open a lot of folks' eyes to some of the depth of the spiritual beings conversation. But the intriguing thing is, while the Bible presents it never gives an argument for existence. And that can be the troubling thing for some folks. How do we really know? There's no argument. It's simply the worldview at the time. And spirits are everywhere. By the time we get to New Testament studies, we've had just this plethora of growth through Second Temple Judaism, or the intertestamental period, between OT and NT, where there's a lot being said about spirits. Particularly going back to Genesis 6, in the Jewish perspective, this is where the demons came from.
Right.
Mating.
And Jews didn't stop thinking about that particular, Jewish persons didn't stop thinking about that particular episode, after the time of the Old Testament, right? There's a host of other literature where Jewish persons are kind of fleshing out what exactly happened here. It's in a collection that people will know as the Pseudepigrapha, for those who are interested in doing some really very interesting, very bizarre reading, but incredibly helpful for fleshing out the very thing that you've been mentioning here.
If you go, if you think about even through the lens of Paul, he's going to talk about how the other gods, he goes back to Psalms, they're simply demons. And so it comes up quite a few times. But I think the most troubling thing is it doesn't make an argument for their existence. Is one thing that we have to remember. It is already part of their worldview. It would be like us arguing for the existence of fish. Like, you've probably eaten fish at some point. And it's real, and you've experienced it in your environment, and no one's really asking if fish are real or not. And I think, you think in that environment, no one's really asking this question. It's a part of their cultural universe, part of their story and their worldview that spirits exist.
I've used the example of the post office before. Like, they don't have to tell us half of the stuff, like how it works, whether it's the spiritual world or something as mundane as sending a letter. They don't have to explain all that, just like we wouldn't have to explain, well, I went to the post office. Now, the post office, by the way, is this place where these people go and they take your mail and they make sure that it's going to go to the right place. We don't have to do all that. They didn't have to do all that. Frustrating for us, because I think we've lost something. The Enlightenment was good in a lot of respects, right? But we've also lost quite a bit of what I think an older generation may have called kind of an enchanted worldview, where they saw that there really were active spiritual realities, just around that we've maybe lost. Yeah.
And that's just thinking about what we have lost. I think that's where the multicultural lenses really are helpful. Sometimes a reader from a different part in our global world has a background that's more comparable to what it was like to live in the New Testament times. And that gives them the gift of being a better reader of the story because of their experiences and so on.
Yeah.
And so we can learn a lot from others in that perspective. Instead of just saying, my culture's the best, we know what we've got going on here. What if we become listeners of other perspectives in other global parts of the world? I think that's a really important thing. In one of my anthropology classes at the seminary, I read a book called The Spirit of the Rainforest. And this, if any book will break your Western mind of spirit, this one will do it.
Spirit of the Rainforest. Okay.
Spirit of the Rainforest. It's about a shaman who incorporates a lot of spirits, and how and you get to hear his story. Eventually, at the end, he meets this great spirit. And I won't do a spoiler. Okay. But the book is, if you're interested in this topic, this book is definitively worth the read, and it should come with a rated R warning for if we have any young listeners listening.
Yeah. Thanks for the heads up there.
Yeah.
One thing that I have found to be true, and I know I'm not the only one. It was one of those things where I had always kind of known this, and then a friend of mine said it, and I thought, that has been my experience too. So he's the first one to actually verbalize this thought for me. But for within Churches of Christ, so like the denomination that I and other mutual friends who have gone through Asbury have gone through, and for which we still teach at their universities and still minister in the churches and so on. Traditionally, not every congregation, but traditionally we've been either ardently or just sort of default cessationist, where they've not really known much what to do of spiritual gifts, particularly what have been called the miraculous gifts, like speaking in tongues, exorcism, whether word of knowledge, healing, stuff like that. They've always been very shy about that stuff, or some have very ardently said, yeah, that doesn't happen anymore. Interestingly, almost every Church of Christ affiliated missionary that I and this other friend have known, and by God's grace, we went to a university that sponsored a lot of international mission teams, and so they did a really good work there. Professors, students, just other people that we've met through those networks. They, for those who have gone to parts of the developing world, almost all of them have some kind of story that sounds intriguingly similar to the kinds of things that we read about in the New Testament. And they want to tell about the good things that God is doing in ushering the gospel and booting out these destructive spiritual forces.
Yes.
But they would get either laughed out of their churches, or their funding would get cut off. And so they're nervous about that kind of thing, but it's, it happens. And like people who grew up in that environment are looking now at this and saying, yeah, there's a lot there. And they were able to see it by stepping out of their mold, that, whether Western or American or whatever, by just getting a broader perspective. They're able to see it. And so even with our relatively small church fellowship, I've seen that play out pretty consistently.
Yeah, speaking of your question about student interest, I'm really grateful for Asbury University and the opportunity to share some of these topics. In the coming spring, I get to do a course called Miracles and Charismata. So we're going to talk about miracles.
Oh,
and gifts.
interesting.
And I feel like this is a good counterpart to the demons and spirits.
You're
In
right.
fact, maybe you shouldn't have one unless you have the other, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, that's a good balance, right? When everything is getting cold
balance.
and dark in the fall, take the demons class. When everything is starting to get really
Yes.
light and beautiful
Halloween.
and blooming in the spring, take the miracles and and miraculous gifts
Yeah.
class. That's a good two-parter. That's how you can pitch it to your dean. Is
Yeah.
that
Yeah. True.
hey, what got you interested in this topic? I mean, ever since I've known you, I will admit, I first met you and you were just a student. You weren't the demon person.
I wasn't the
that
demon.
that wasn't you, yeah. No, but I didn't know that was your topic, and then until you and Tom Lyons, who I've had on the podcast before,
Yeah.
and I all were realizing, okay, not only are we defending our dissertations in the same year, but literally in the same week, because
Yes.
Keener was
Wow.
elsewhere, guest teaching at Trinity, I think. And so we just all, locked arms and said, all right, we're going to power through and we're going to finish these things together. But what got you interested in this topic in the first place?
Yeah. So I grew up in a charismatic kind of churches, and always non-denominational, and always around these kinds of things, thinking of whether you're thinking of word of wisdom or word of knowledge, and or miracles. I can remember being a little girl and seeing people get prayed for and things change for them. And so I had this experience from a really young person's perspective. And I got to seminary and a PhD, Asbury Seminary, and I lo and behold, I stumbled across, I had just met Medine in the student center back when it used to be
Right.
where
Yeah.
she worked, and
That's
then I met
Maydeen Keener,
Craig.
for those who
Nadine Keener,
might not
yeah, is
know,
Craig
who
Keener's
is
wife.
just an absolute wonderful human being,
She
delightful
is.
person to be around, is an extraordinary saint. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Top notch.
as is Craig Keener, who was my dissertation supervisor,
Mhm.
and I had a meeting Craig Keener for the first time. It is his first year at Asbury Seminary. It is also my first year at Asbury Seminary,
Mhm.
and so we are the newbies on campus, the two of us.
Yeah.
And he said, so we got to talking. We got to talking about my charismatic background. I did 2 master's degrees at Oral Roberts University and
Mhm.
had a very rich experience growing in faith and academics at Oral Roberts University. And he said something to me that day that really much changed the trajectory. I was really interested in writing on the atonement, and wrote something altogether different from my dissertation topic when I proposed that I would like to be a student. And so um, Craig said, I'm thinking it would be really good for a student to write something on spirit possession. And I know you have a charismatic background. Would you at all be interested in a dissertation on this topic? And I thought to myself, oh boy, I really need to pray about this. This is a dark topic.
Yeah.
When you do a dissertation, the amount of hours of reading that you do on something is quite a lot. And I didn't want to take on to bite off more than I could chew, to be idiomatic.
Yeah.
And so I said, let me spend some time praying about whether or not this is right for me. I was hesitant to want to jump on it, and I
Mhm.
really got to thinking about 2 things. From my own background, there's sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes in charismatic circles, there's an overemphasis on demons.
Mhm.
In other words, the demon causes every single problem, and even to the extent that everything is over spiritualized, and even avoiding going to doctors for health treatments because it's a demon problem. So
Yeah.
sometimes in a malformed version of Christianity, or malformed version of charisma, I would say there's just this extreme emphasis that everything is a demon. And then on the other hand, in a lot of Western theological training, like we went back to that parable, there's nothing.
Yeah.
And so I had these polls in my mind of like all or nothing, and thinking, couldn't there be a balance to this some way, so that maybe a charismatic person could see it from a fuller perspective and a westernized person could see it from a multicultural perspective? And so I thought, I really want to do this. I really want to take this on. And I would have never guessed then that it would culminate here. I didn't
There
have
it
this
is.
vision at that moment. So there is God's faithfulness. But that was kind of how I got into the topic. And if I could take I know one of your next questions is, what are the next steps for Christians when
Yeah.
we think about
Yeah.
and this ties right in. So I'm going to tackle this question now.
Go for it.
If we go all the way back to C.S. Lewis, he said this. He said, there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally both pleased by both errors.
Mm-hmm.
And so this one, my book doesn't say that every time you're sick, it's a spirit, or every time you experience difficulty, it's the spirit. But the heart behind it is that you could have an interpretive table and everyone pulls up their seat. So you have someone who comes to you in your churches, they're having a problem. What are we going to do? Could you imagine yourself? And I'll read just one, I'll give you one more little sneak peek of
Go for
the
it.
text.
Yeah.
Imagine yourself sitting at a table and discussing any one of the stories that have been told in the monograph, whether biblical or modern. Next, imagine each seat at the table represents an interpretation or an interpretive position. The seats could be named sociology, psychology, medicine, spirituality, anthropology. There are a lot of interpretations that people will think about when they think about these sort of events. For far too long, because of the impact of the Enlightenment and the bent of rationalism, the only seats allowed at the table belonged to scientifically geared disciplines. The disciplines could disapprove the reality of spirits because they were not observable. And this has caused the silencing of the multicultural perspective, which has now been carefully observed and highlighted by anthropologists in a wide variety of cultural perspectives. Even if the observed experiences and testimonies of modern anthropological works do not convince one of the reality of spirits, the weight of the testimony and the analogy to the New Testament calls for a seat at the interpretive table. In other words, if 74% of our world experiences or populations have eyewitness to some of these experiences, could we say, maybe what we're dealing with here is a spiritual problem? And a shout out to the Roman Catholic kind of perspective on this. If you were going to go and say, in that tradition, if you go and say, I have a spiritual problem and I'm really concerned, they would do medical analysis and psychological analysis and think about social situations and networks and do all of this kind of observation before sending a person or diagnosing with a spiritual problem. And so I don't have any intent to dissuade from the reality of medicine or psychology or any of that. It's not to be dismissive or reductionistic at all. But we also have spiritual things that have been experienced by a lot of folks. And so if I could give you a really broad stroke of the chapters, chapter 4, it's Spirits Make Me Sick. And so thinking about possession and illness.
That's a great title.
The second,
your chapters are so much more creatively titled than mine.
The 5th chapter is Spirits Make Me Violent and Strong.
Oh,
and
nice.
the 6th chapter is Spirits Make Me Speak. And so I have surveyed biblical accounts and modern accounts kind of on all of these characteristics, and you can read all of the stories about that in the book.
Yeah. Joy, this has been a delight. I know we're near the end of your time. Do you have time for one more question?
I sure do. Do.
Great. What surprised you most in your research?
Yeah, I prepared for this one.
Okay.
Just wanted to have evidence. If your listener is ready to have their mind bent a little bit, bear with me. So actually chapter 4, which is titled Spirits Make Me Sick, the subtitle Spirit Possession and Illness. And so I began to survey a lot of the anthropological and ethnographic research. There's a lot of this research. It's not like it's a tiny bed. I mean, this topic is well studied in both anthropology and ethnography, and it's intentional. The title of the chapter is intentionally provocative, by the way. It's meant to catch your attention and say, whoa,
Yeah.
what's happening here? In George Murdoch's book, is a book called Theories of Illness, over 97% of societies he studied associate possession with illness. And so having this idea that a spirit could make you sick is very prevalent in different perspectives. And then another person, Richard C. Fiedler, he writes about his experiences with the Sarawak Chinese people. He says, finding societies where it is believed that evil spirits cause illness and misfortune is easy. And I thought, that's not really very easy in my Western. When I have a headache, I take a Tylenol. I don't typically pray first. And so in some case, I kind of wondered, maybe I should pray and take the Tylenol.
Yeah.
Because I do believe we are spiritual. Like we do, we are spiritual beings, temples of the Holy Spirit. And so I remember reading that it's easy. And then I started to research. That was the first chapter that I did. And literally that chapter could have been hundreds of pages longer. Every single anthropological and ethnographic study I picked up, there was attestation to the fact of these spirit sicknesses. And that could have been, infertility or pain or all sorts of different things. And they were attributed to having a spiritual cause. And that's just really, it's really just caused me to think. It really challenges my Western framework a lot about illness, to be honest with you.
Sure.
But it is the story of the woman bent over, right? And or we think about stories that we have in our New Testament, and when the demons go stand up. And sometimes we have maybe even a blurring of, is it medical or is it spiritual? Even in Luke's gospel, he tends to blur a little bit, where it's, maybe not as clear, or maybe it's both. And is there overlap between physical and spiritual as well?
Yeah.
How is that for the most interesting thing there, Kevin?
I think you have adequately tantalized listeners who should go rush out and buy your book, which I will have a link to in the description below. Joy, I know for a fact that we could talk another hour about this kind of thing, because in just in those times where we were all sitting around the lunch table talking about our research, and talking about mutual friends who have experienced some pretty significant things that look somewhat like the kind of stuff that we read about in the New Testament. And I know there's more that we could say. I was actually talking to a friend just yesterday who is teaching through the Gospel of Mark, and I asked him, do you anticipate anybody in your class asking about the demoniac there in chapter 5, because he's about to get to chapter 5. And he said, well, they ask some questions like this in class, but I don't know. And I said, well, I'm just curious, what will you say? And he gave a good answer that was very gentle for his audience. But he asked me, what would you say? And I was like, man, I've known too many people, and it's because of my experiences at Asbury and getting to know people that from the U.S. and from outside the U.S. who have experienced stuff like this. Your next steps for Christians today is spot on, and I appreciate that. Yeah,
we had a lot of interest, and if I could reference back to the Outpouring, we had a lot of interest in spiritual warfare come on our campus, and I think that's a good thing to learn and grow. My next step for the reader is really to remind of C.S. Lewis's thing. If your theology is mainly built around a study of demons, I think we have I like to say, I think we have a discipleship problem.
Mhm.
And I think it's frustrating, as New Testament scholars can feel, for the limited amount of evidence, we have a good bit, but it's not everything.
Yeah.
Like, all of these stories point to Jesus. And I think we need to balance our demonology with healthy pneumatology, studying the Holy Spirit, thinking about having a deep relationship with Jesus Christ, and just really being rooted in Christology, to say, or even having in-depth doctrine of God. And so I think there can be a temptation. This is fascinating stuff, and there can be a temptation to sort of let it overtake you.
Yeah.
But I think keeping this balanced in your theology, it's not everything. The New Testament is not a handbook for deliverance, right?
Right.
It doesn't give you a step-by-step formulaic guide to how to get rid of a demon, but we do see what Jesus does. And I've always been so really grateful. If you want another book to read, very classic in New Testament studies, is by Graham Twelftree, who wrote a note for the cover of my book. I was very grateful for his words. And his book is named In the Name of Jesus, and a great book. He goes through these stories, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and thinks about it through the rest of the New Testament lens. It is a classic book on this topic in New Testament studies, one of my very favorite books on the topic. And so if you want a companion to this book, it's a really good exegesis in there.
Yeah. Well, Joy, thank you so much for your time. I hope people are encouraged to go out and buy your book. I know I am. I'm going to be getting it, and I appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us today.
Thank you, Kevin.